Hey time travelers, I just got my $600 stimulus check and it reminded me about upgrading this computer, and I always wanted to do a video where I went and made fun of the really bad reviews on all the computer parts that I got. Because sometimes people just don't know what they're doing, you know, and you just gotta roast them. Before we get into the video, a couple of things. First, I do not suggest you do this with your stimulus check, especially if you don't have a job. You know, you use it to get by, pay for the essentials, or invest. In my case, I was investing in my YouTube channel. Second thing, I really need help. I'm a brand new channel, and the best way you can help me is with likes, subscribe, and comments. So, why don't you watch the video and decide if you want to comment or like or give me a subscription, because that really helps me out. All right, moving on. I got 3 videos. You can always go back and watch them later. I'll link them in the description below, but here's the one stimulus check. And then it took 2 videos to do the upgrade because my son was helping me and I was making sure that he learned as we went along how it all worked. But let's get started making fun of these bad reviews. Starting with the CPU. I chose this CPU because it was middle of the ground and had a lot of performance for the dollar. It's the AMD Ryzen 5 3600. Let's go down to these 1 egg reviews first. Going through the return process, which is not fast in the slightest, I was annoyed because the rest of my parts for my PC, not this one, which came first, and I returned. So they're complaining that their parts didn't all show up at the same time. Can we get to the point why you have a negative review for this part, not the shipping? I mean, for crying out loud. I returned a few days after noticing the pins. So you put your computer together without looking at the CPU's pins first? That's hard to believe. It's more likely you bent the pins, since you don't know that you have to put your computer together when all of the parts are there, not just some of the parts. My CPU was stolen, so I wouldn't know. Huh? Cons. I would love to write a great review, but I cannot since my CPU was stolen during shipment and I haven't received a replacement yet. Probably not stolen. Probably just lost in shipping, you know. Sometimes bad shippers are bad shippers. They lose things, or they go like in loops. They go from one state to another and then another state. I bought something off of Newegg once and I didn't get it for 6 months. I called and complained and they sent it to me. And then I ended up with 2 of the same thing. Well, whatever. CPU is stuck at max boost clock on all cores. Being new, I have no help on the internet. Did you try Googling CPU is stuck, max boost on all cores? Now they're saying they're new at this. They're being new, but they're talking about their idle temps are 45 to 50 C, 80 C under load with water cooling. Well, guess what? That's normal. Those are normal temps. Since you're new and you have no help on the internet, have you discovered Google yet? While you're researching the internet, have you tried maybe clearing your CMOS or updating your BIOS? So since you're new at Googling things, I'll just throw you a bone. That's what you want to try to do. I'm getting very high idle temps on 50 to 60 Celsius. So we'll just check the temperature of my CPU running right now. I'm just recording in OBS and I have a browser open. That's about it. What's my CPU core temperature? 55 degrees Celsius. And the fan's running at 65% speed, and I've got a water cooler. Those are normal temperatures, folks. Don't leave 1-star reviews because your CPU's running at normal temperature. The thermal design power, TDP, of every CPU is different. Do your research. I could be on the CPU forever. Let's move on to the Corsair iQ H100i. This is my water cooling unit that I'm running. Pump very loud. Too many wires. No, I do have to agree on that. It was a pain in the butt. Difficult to install, performance subpar. Not sure what all the hype is about these things. Well, maybe if there's a lot of hype, that means you had the opportunity to see other water coolers, to see rave reviews about possibly better options. Performs worse than my CryoRig H7, which is a quarter of the price. It's a CryoRig H7. That's an air cooler for a quieter setup. The pump is louder on quiet mode than my GPU while playing games. What do you mean quiet mode? quiet mode? Maybe he's referring to the stock fans, because I'm not using the stock fans. If you look at the CryoRig H7, it's got a fancy single fan on it. And water coolers are more expensive to produce, so they usually come with cheap fans. That's something you have to learn. If you watch tech tubers build PCs, they always swap the fans out with quieter ones. And if you look at fan specs, they've got a decibel rating, like how loud it's going to be. Oh, this is a bad one. This is a horrible one. He's like writing a whole freaking book here. If you have an AMD processor, blah, 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 don't expect a special backplate like the rest of the coolers come with. Instead, you have to use the stock AMD backplate. If you don't have those, you're completely out of luck. How would you not have the stock AMD backplate? Did you throw it away? Did you lose it? Did you buy the motherboard used and it didn't have the stock backplate? That's not the freaking thing's fault. They try to make the product as cheap as possible. I have this sweet water cooler and I can't use it. Boo frickety hoo, guy. Make sure you don't lose your backplate and clip retention brackets. Yeah, okay, I'm done reading this review. He left a 1 egg review and he said, really, guys? Oh my God. I have to move on with my life. I have to, no. Difficult to install. Will update once installed. So he left a review without actually installing it, okay? The screws do not fit right, period. I spent a few hours trying to get the screws in. I got 6 of the 8 fan screws to fit flush after all that effort. Using the wrong screws, probably? I should not have to try so hard to get the fans mounted to the radiator. I'm not some tiny person either. It doesn't matter how physically big you are. You get a screwdriver, you get the right screw, you line up the holes, and you put the thing in the holes. I have a bruise on the palm of my hand and 3 stripped screw heads. Stop talking. You don't know how to build computers. Watch more videos, and then go back and try again. They're gonna zip tie the fan to the radiator. He says, destroyed my storage. Shorted my storage units. Malfunctioned. What? I'll never know because it malfunctioned and destroyed my storage units. Are you talking about solid state drives or hard drives? I'm pretty sure in the instructions it says make sure you use a separate power cable. That's the only way I could think of it shorting other stuff. Either that or you had an electrostatic discharge, you know, ESD, and shocked your stuff. I'm not seeing it, guy. Oh, that was difficult to read. So bad. Now let's read the bad reviews for my motherboard. Does not boot. Buyer beware, especially since it's non-refundable. It is so refundable. You just put it back in the box and email Newegg, and they take care of you. PC did not boot after double checking that everything is seated correctly and testing with my older graphics card. Well, this might blow your mind, but there's a debug LED on the motherboard. And if you look in the freaking motherboard manual, it tells you what each freaking LED means. Like, this one thing's not plugged in right, or this CPU's not plugged in right, or CPU power, or your GPU, or whatever the frick it is. All you gotta do is look at the light. Pros does everything. Does everything. Hangs on shutdown or a hard reboot. Gives it a 1 star, and it's got this giant book that they wrote so they can publish it to the Newegg. This board is amazing, it does it all, but I have went through 2 returned ones. The first one just kept the second one. What? Wait a second. But I went through 2, RMA'd the first one and just kept the second one. Flashed the BIOS and tried different RAM, reseated the CPU, 3 different video cards. I've tried it all and it will not boot properly or hard shutdown. Again, are you looking at the debug LEDs? They're there for a reason. The fan on the board chipset only ever spins up on boot and never comes back on. It's not supposed to. It only turns on in the beginning as a test to make sure it works. And it only comes on later if the chipset gets hot. Oh, you finally talking about the easy debug light for the VGA will stay on, and that is it. That means you have a bad video card, or maybe you're not plugging in the power into your video card. Resetting CMOS or just flicking the PSU switch or letting it sit off for 10 seconds resets whatever the problem is, and then it will boot up fine. It sounds like a power supply problem. He just goes on and on. It's like he's trying many different things, but none of them make sense. Now here's one that really bothers me, and it's like, you have to like think of how many of these bad reviews there are and try to think, okay, this product has a couple thousand or whatever reviews. Give it one more egg, because there's got to be a lot of these bad eggs, as it were, in here, as in people who don't know what they're doing. And from their review, you can't see what they're doing wrong, but they kind of, in a way, said that they did it wrong 3 times. RMA twice, same issue both times. No post, which means power on self-test. That's the screen with the white text on the black background. No debug lights, okay? No debug lights at all. No post, no debug lights. Usually means the computer is not put together correctly. Tested it, all the other components in separate build, and they worked fine. Contacted MSI support and was told it was probably my fault and they couldn't do anything about it. It says 2 replacement boards have failed, which sounds like you tried 3 different motherboards. The probability of you getting 3 motherboards that won't post at all is so small that it has to be you. It has to be something you've done. And this is like not really accusing you or saying, oh, you must be a moron. No, it's the way you look at life. It's like, oh, if I keep repeating the same thing and it doesn't work, then let's try doing something different. That's the kind of concept. Why don't you spend 10 minutes reading the motherboard manual? And maybe someone will, like a light bulb will pop up over your head, like, let's try this. Instead of leaving a 1-star review, frequent BSOD. That's Windows blue screen of death. I don't need to read this. I don't need to read this at all. Because if you're ever getting frequent BSODs, first thing you do is reinstall Windows. Actually, let's read this a little bit real fast. They never reinstalled Windows. I think I fixed it since the BIOS thought I had slower RAM. No, that's not how RAM works. There's the base clock. So your base RAM on this board, memory standard, doesn't really say here, but I'm pretty sure it's the 2800. And I got 3600. And it ran at 2800 because that's the standard spec for the board. If you want the higher stuff, which is technically overclocked, but they've tested that memory to work at that overclock and advertise that number, you actually have to go on your motherboard and change that speed. So he says, and I manually put in the factory settings for the RAM. No. No. You manually put in the overclock settings for the RAM. You were running factory. But I purchased RAM that was on the approved list, so blah, oh my God. Can't look at this anymore. Let's move on to my actual RAM that I got. Now let's look at these 1egg reviews. See how many derpers we have. The default XMP profile is not stable on X570 Ryzen 3950X, resulting in BSOD and memory corruption. Do you mean memory corruption and BSOD? Because the memory corruption happens before the BSOD. Updates the firmware to fix the unstable XMP profile to be compatible on X570 boards. No, that's not how that works, sir. I have not had any trouble with this RAM. What you're suggesting is they upgrade the firmware on the RAM. No, that's not how it works. All the RAM says is what it is and what it's capable of, and it reports that to the motherboard. How the motherboard handles that is an entirely different thing. So what you're asking is that they upgrade the BIOS on your motherboard, okay? Make sure you write that down so you don't forget it. The BIOS on the motherboard is what handles the memory stability. Some motherboard manufacturers have charts where you can check to see what kind of available memory that's out there, whether or not it works on that board. I checked mine before I bought it, and if it didn't work, I would put a negative review on the motherboard, not the RAM. Quality RAM, good performance, looks great for 24 hours. What? Blah, 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 blah. I won't buy another branded power supply. What? I thought we were talking about RAM. Love my keyboards, blah, blah, blah. That being said, sending these RAM sticks back. I believe the LED component in these RAM sticks are simply terrible. Mine still work. What are you talking about? Are you talking about the RGB that's on there, or are you talking about your power supply? Did you leave your review on the wrong thing? They both work perfectly. As soon as I try to change a color setting in the iCUE, the stick in slot 1 goes completely out and the second one stays rainbow and doesn't react to the software. Now, what I think he's talking about is the difficulty to actually use the software, because check this out. Looks like this. Here I'm on the memory now. Go to lighting effects. I had to figure out how to set it up to be a gradient from blue to purple to red to purple back to blue and then cycle. And I had to select all 4 of these. So it might be something like that. It's a huge learning curve to this software. And he shouldn't be leaving a negative review on the RAM necessarily, because I don't know. Yes, the software sucks. Hardly stable at 3200 megahertz. My specific model is blah, 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 whatever that is. It's a Nanya. A Nanya. Is that like Nyan Cat? My kit refuses to run the specified speed of DDR4 3600. You gotta try different XMP profiles until you get one that works. And maybe it's the AORUS X570 Elite motherboard. Did you update your BIOS? I don't see you mentioning that. I mean, if I were to leave a negative review, I would say the name of my motherboard and that I double check the BIOS version. Avoid if you're trying to actually hit DDR4 3600. Well, if you want to see something. Right there, you can see in my IQ software, and you can also see it in CPU-Z. My DRAM frequency is about 1800, and you double that because it's DDR, double data rate. So 1800 times 2 is 3600. And I've got my cast latency down to 16. And there's all my timings. It was actually set up in my motherboard as an option to just choose that latency and timing setup. I'm like, oh, brainless option. Enter. All right, let's move on to my SSD. I got an Evo because I'm poor, people. And maybe someday I'll get a Pro that runs on PCI Generation 4. This is, like you see here, it's a Gen 3. But my motherboard does Gen 4. That'll be sweet. It's reviews. Reviews and 1 eggs. Hey, here's a smart one. Warning, make sure your motherboard BIOS will support these before you buy them. I had a BIOS update from 2018. From 2018? Are you living in the past? Guess what? We're in the future! I have a no brand NVMe that performs better than this. 600 megabyte write speeds and terrible for this price. If you have it hooked up to the correct slot, you know, it can't just be any old M.2 slot. It's got to be the one under the CPU. That's the fastest one if you read your motherboard manual. I'm reading this and he says he has another NVMe. So he probably has an existing SSD up underneath the CPU and he added this as a second one on a slower channel. I could not use it. The delivery took an eternity. I sent it back when it arrived. I already had my new build running. That is not the product. That's just the seller, because Newegg is a marketplace. Don't put a negative review on the product because you took forever for it to arrive. You call the seller, whether it be Newegg, whoever, and chew them out. Computer won't post. I hope that none of my components are dead. Well, you didn't try anything, so I'm wondering if maybe some brain cells are dead. Were you smoking? Because you're not trying anything here. You haven't done anything. Well, that's it. That's enough of roasting all these random negative reviews. I can tell you what I feel about each thing. CPU works great. It runs colder than my old AMD FX 8350, but then that was a really high TDP chip, so whatever, no complaint there. It has 4 more threads than the other one had, and its clock rate is a lot faster, so it's a huge improvement for me. But then again, that CPU was 5 years old when I upgraded to this one. Now this cooler, it did have a difficult to use mounting mechanism. As in, you had to read the instructions carefully. You use the existing AMD bracket, and it just says do not screw the screws too tightly. Whereas most other coolers, water cooler or air coolers, they all just say screw it all the way down until it stops. This one doesn't. If you keep screwing it down, it pops off, and you're like, oh, well, I didn't read the whole thing, and you read it. And the RGB on it looks pretty good, but I wish, my personal opinion is that if it had an option to not have RGB and just be a solid color, but since it's RGB, it's got that weird opaque white whatever. But whatever, you know, everything's got RGB on it these days, so you just have to live with it, because I couldn't find a good CPU cooler that didn't have RGB. Now this motherboard, I would have preferred its debug LED. Come on, you jerk, zoom in. Zoom the frick in, I want to see the board. Struggles. Well, the debug LED, since it won't let me zoom in, I guess I'll just zoom in post, are like all right here, and you have to get a flashlight and point at it. And then, okay, it's like, okay, that's the third one. And you look at the motherboard manual and go, oh, okay, I forgot to plug in this thing, right? Where a lot of other ones have like letters and numbers. Like, oh, it's F3. What's F3 mean? Oh, I have to plug in this thing. It's a lot easier. Also, there's no clear CMOS button on the motherboard, and I end up putting a button on it. It had the pins. You know, the two things were like, oh, you just need to short the jumper or whatever, where a lot of YouTubers get a screwdriver and do that. And I'm like, I don't want to be careful and connect two other things with my screwdriver. So I got one of those things that plug onto there, and then you have a button at the other end. Like, click, CMOS button. That's really it. Otherwise, this board has been great for me so far. It runs everything I need. You know, I got a GPU right here. I got my SSD in there. CPU there, all 4 memory slots populated. Sometimes it won't turn on, and I had to clear the CMOS once. And it said something about CPU. And I'm thinking that's because of this cooler not mounting my CPU properly. If you guys know, and you can confirm, and you're more clever than these people I roasted today, tell me in the comments. Now the memory, honestly, even though the RGB controlling software is a pain in the butt, and I'm very careful about not putting pain in my butt parts, the Corsair software is easier to work with than the MSI software. Just putting that out there. As for this SSD, it's been working great. No problems. I even cloned my old SATA SSD to it, booted up, and didn't have any problems at all. And I might want to mention that when I was running this SATA SSD, I installed Windows 10 Fresh for all this hardware, instead of running all my drivers and things from my old 8350, because I'm not suicidal. That's it for this video. If you've enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate for a like down there. If you want to see more, make sure you get subscribed and then click the bell so that you get notifications. And tell me about some experiences you've had with computer parts where maybe you learned something and you weren't a bonehead and you didn't leave the negative review on the wrong item. Like, we've seen so many examples where somebody had a problem with their memory, but it was the motherboard's fault, and they put the review on the memory. Just tell me how you did better. And if you want to see the thought process I went through to buy all these parts, I'll put a video right here. And if you want to see something different, something a little interesting, I do sci-fi videos sometimes, and there's gonna be one right here. If you want to @ me, there's all my stuff there, and you can subscribe to the channel over here. So thanks for watching. Bye.